Hi there. Welcome to Dreamy Histories channel. Tonight, we're wandering through moonlit medieval streets, where the aroma of meat pies mingles with wood smoke, and shadowy figures hurry past clutching warm bundles of food wrapped in rough cloth. You can almost taste the greasy fingers and feel the crunch of twice-baked bread as exhausted workers stumble through narrow alleyways, searching for something, anything, to fill their bellies before collapsing into bed. Let's be honest though, if you actually travelled back to sample medieval street food, you probably wouldn't survive the first questionable meat pasty without a serious case of what they charmingly called the flux. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your location and local time in the comments below. Now, let's drift back in time. You're standing in London, sometime around 1375, and it's well past sunset. The church bells have long since rung Compline, that final prayer service before bed. But the streets aren't empty, far from it. You hear voices calling out in the darkness, hot pies, fresh from the oven, and your stomach growls in response. This isn't some modern invention, this late-night food culture. Medieval workers kept brutal hours, especially during harvest season or when major construction projects demanded round-the-clock labor. Stone masons working on cathedrals, dock workers unloading ships that arrived with the tide regardless of the hour, night watchmen making their rounds. They all needed to eat, and they needed it fast. You follow your nose toward Cheapside, where the smell of roasted meat grows stronger. A woman stands beside a wooden cart, steam rising from cloth-covered baskets. She's what they call a huckster, one of many food vendors who prowl the streets after dark. The mainstream historical record tells us these vendors were licensed and regulated, required to sell only during certain hours and in designated areas. But here's the quirky bit most people don't know. Many of these late-night food sellers were women, often widows, who found this one of the few respectable ways to earn a living independently. The church technically frowned upon working after dark, associating it with sin and moral decay. But empty stomachs have a way of overruling religious doctrine. You watch as a group of apprentices pools their farthings to buy what the vendor calls a coffin, not the burial kind, but a hard pastry shell filled with meat and gravy. They tear into it with their hands, passing it around, gravy dripping down their chins, no plates, no forks. Just pure medieval convenience food. The filling is supposed to be beef, but you notice the vendor's eyes shift when someone asks too many questions about the meat's origin. Historians still argue whether these street meats were primarily made from fresh ingredients or recycled from the leftovers of grand feasts in noble houses, a medieval version of yesterday's special. The concept of fast food might seem impossibly modern, but you're witnessing its true origins. These medieval workers didn't have time for proper sit-down meals any more than a modern office worker grabbing a burger between meetings. They needed calories, they needed them cheap, and they needed them now. The vendor counts her coins by candlelight, mentally calculating whether she sold enough to pay her rent and buy ingredients for tomorrow's batch. You notice something else, the social mixing happening around these late-night food carts. A merchant's son rubs shoulders with a chimney sweep, both united in their hunger and exhaustion. These democratic moments around food would be impossible in a formal tavern or inn, where social hierarchies were strictly maintained. But here in the darkness, with only the flickering light from the vendor's lantern, everyone's just another hungry mouth to feed. As you move deeper into the medieval night, following the trail of food smells and whispered transactions, you realize you're not just observing the birth of convenience food. You're watching the emergence of an entire underground economy that thrived in the shadows between sunset and dawn, feeding the workers who built the medieval world one questionable meat pie at a time. You push through the crowded market square as dawn breaks, and everywhere you look, people are clutching small, golden brown objects that fit perfectly in their palms. These are the true kings of medieval street food: hand pies, pasties, and their countless regional variations. A baker near you shouts about his hot coffins, and you realize these portable pastries are literally everywhere, from the poorest neighborhoods to the edges of castle grounds where servants grab quick meals between duties. The genius of the ham pie hits you as you watch a blacksmith eat one while still working his bellows with the other hand. No utensils needed, no plates to wash, and the crust serves as both container and part of the meal. You bite into one yourself. The pastry is thick, almost impossibly hard on the outside, designed to survive being tossed into a worker's pouch and carried around for hours. Inside, the filling is a mystery medley of meat, onions, and whatever root vegetables were cheap that week. The taste is, well, let's just say modern food safety standards would have some serious concerns. What most people don't realize is that these medieval pies weren't just food. They were an early form of food preservation technology, the thick, hard crust sealed in the filling, keeping it edible for days. Miners in Cornwall perfected this with their famous pasties, crimping the edges so thick that miners could hold them with their arsenic-contaminated hands without poisoning the edible parts. They'd eat the filling and toss the contaminated crust edge, the original disposable food packaging. You wander toward the docks where ship workers are loading cargo, and a completely different pie culture emerges. Here, the pies are smaller, greasier, designed to be eaten in 2 or 3 bites between hauling crates. A vendor explains, while you pretend to understand his thick medieval English, that she makes special Friday pies filled with fish for religious days when meat is forbidden. She winks and admits that sometimes the fish pies contain whatever swims, which might include eels, frogs, or anything else vaguely aquatic. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely believed beaver counted as fish for religious purposes, or if they just pretended to be that naive when it suited their stomachs. The economics of pie making fascinate you as you watch vendors at work. A successful pie maker might produce hundreds of these portable meals daily, each one precisely sized to match common coin denominations. A farthing pie for the poorest workers, a penny pie with actual identifiable meat for craftsmen, and elaborate 2-penny versions for merchants containing exotic spices that cost more than the meat itself. You notice one vendor carefully painting his luxury pies with saffron-tinted egg wash at medieval saffron prices. That golden shine costs more than the entire filling. But here's where it gets truly weird. You spot children running through the streets carrying baskets of tiny pies no bigger than modern cookies. These waste pies are made from the scraps and trimmings of larger pies, pressed together and baked into bite-sized snacks sold for quarter farthings. Nothing goes to waste in the medieval food economy, and these pie children, yes, that's what they called them, represent an entire secondary market built on leftovers. You follow a group of university students who seem to have developed an entire culture around competitive pie eating. They're arguing about whether a proper scholar's pie should contain more suet or more pepper, and one insists his mother's recipe includes a secret ingredient that makes the crust last through a full lecture on Aristotle without crumbling. Another claims he once survived an entire week eating nothing but pocket pies during examinations, though his friends suggest the resulting philosophical vapors cleared out an entire lecture hall. The regional variations astound you as merchants from different towns hawk their local specialties. Pork pies from Melton Mowbray, already showing signs of the recipe that would become famous centuries later. Eel pies from London. You politely decline to sample that one. And something from Yorkshire that appears to be filled with blood pudding and oats that the vendor swears puts hair on your chest and fire in your belly. A travelling merchant from the far north tries to sell you something he calls a Scotch pie, but the other vendors mutter darkly about foreign foods and make protective signs over their own wares. As the morning progresses, you realize these hand pies aren't just food. They're the foundation of medieval mobile life. Every profession has its preferred pie, every region its secret recipe, every economic class its designated filling. You watch a noble lady send her servant to buy pies from a specific vendor who supposedly uses only gentle meats, whatever that means, while right next to him, labourers devour pies that seem to contain more gristle than meat. The democratic pie shell contains multitudes, hiding class differences and questionable ingredients alike under its golden brown embrace. You stumble into the Boar's Head Tavern, ducking under the low doorway as the smell of ale and roasted something hits you like a medieval freight train. This isn't just a drinking establishment. You're standing in what amounts to a 14th century fast food restaurant, minus the drive-through window, but with all the questionable hygiene. The tavern keeper, a woman built like she could arm wrestle a knight and win, barks orders at serving girls who weave between tables, carrying trenchers piled high with food that patrons are wrapping in cloth and rushing out the door. The scene before you shatters any romantic notions of leisurely medieval dining. A merchant gulps down a bowl of pottage while simultaneously negotiating with his apprentice, then tosses coins on the table and grabs a wrapped bundle of cold meat for the road. Two construction workers lean against the wall, sharing a wooden plate of something that might generously be called stew, eating as fast as their bodies allow. Nobody's here for the ambiance. They're here because the Boar's Head serves food fast, cheap, and without asking too many questions about whether you can afford a proper seat. You notice the ingenious system these taverns have developed. Near the door, there's what can only be described as a medieval takeout counter. Customers who don't have time to sit can point at pre-made items, cold pies from this morning, leftover roast from yesterday's feast, bread soaked in meat drippings, cheese that's seen better days but still technically edible. The tavern keeper wraps these offerings in large cabbage leaves or rough cloth, creating portable meals for workers who need to eat while walking to their next job. It's disturbingly efficient, like watching a proto-McDonald's operated by people who think bathing more than twice a year is showing off. Here's something historians rarely mention in those romantic medieval documentaries. Taverns operated on a credit system that would make modern payday lenders jealous. You watch as regular customers simply nod at the keeper, who makes mysterious marks on a wooden tally stick. These workers are essentially buying lunch on credit, promising to settle up when they get paid at week's end. The keeper's daughter confides that her mother charges interest in the form of forgotten tallies, a medieval version of hidden fees that would make a modern banker proud. The food itself ranges from probably safe to definitely an adventure. The main offering is perpetual stew, a terrifying concoction that never fully empties. They just keep adding new ingredients to whatever's left from yesterday. You watch in horrified fascination as the cook tosses in what appears to be leftover pie filling, some vegetables that have seen better decades, and meat of indeterminate origin. Historians still argue whether perpetual stew was a practical solution to food waste or just a medieval form of biological warfare. But the real innovation you're witnessing is the birth of combination meals for a standard price. Workers can get a bowl of pottage, a hunk of bread, and a mug of small ale, the weak breakfast beer that medieval people drank instead of water, because at least the brewing process killed most of the bacteria. Some taverns even offer what they call the workers' feast, a trencher bread bowl filled with whatever's hot, plus ale, plus a small cheese to take for later. It's basically a medieval value meal, minus the toy and definitely minus any nutritional information. You're particularly intrigued by the takeaway drink situation, since glass bottles are expensive and pottery breaks. Customers bring their own containers, leather pouches, hollowed-out gourds, or even pig bladders, yes, really, to carry ale away. One enterprising tavern has started offering ale by the skin, pre-filled leather pouches that customers can buy outright. The markup is outrageous, but convenience has its price in any century. The social dynamics fascinate you as much as the food service. Unlike formal inns where travelers might spend hours over a meal, tavern culture is all about speed and efficiency. You witness a kind of medieval lunch rush as workers flood in around midday, the keeper and her staff moving with practiced efficiency to serve as many customers as possible before they have to return to their labor. There's a beautiful chaos to it. Orders shouted over the din, coins flying, food being passed hand to hand over the crowd. As evening approaches, the tavern's takeaway service shifts into high gear. Workers who've been laboring since dawn stumble in, too exhausted to cook at home. They grab wrapped parcels of food and head out into the growing darkness. The keeper starts offering nighttime specials, usually yesterday's leftovers reheated and heavily spiced to mask any questionable flavors. You overhear her telling a customer that the extra pepper aids digestion, though you suspect it's more about disguising the taste of meat that's traveled a bit too far past its prime. You hold your breath as you approach the shambles, York's notorious street of butchers, where the stench of blood and offal mingles with smoke from dozens of small fires. Medieval meat vendors cluster here like carnivorous mushrooms, each stall presenting its own unique interpretation of what constitutes fresh meat. A burly man with arms like ham hocks waves what he claims is a prime cut of beef, though in the flickering torchlight it could honestly be anything from horse to last week's dog that stopped moving. The meat trade after dark takes on an entirely different character from the daytime markets. You watch vendors frantically trying to sell off the day's remaining stock before it spoils completely. Medieval refrigeration consisting mainly of hope and prayer. One creative butcher has started what he calls sunset specials, aggressively discounting meat that won't survive until morning. Better in your belly than feeding the rats, he shouts, which isn't exactly the most appetizing sales pitch you've ever heard. What's genuinely disturbing is the recycling system you're witnessing. That expensive roast served at a noble's feast this afternoon. Its remnants are here now, carved into smaller pieces and sold as lordly cuts to gullible customers who want to taste how the other half lives. One vendor specializes in what she calls twice-cooked treasures, essentially leftover cooked meat that's been re-roasted, with heavy spices to create an entirely new product. The medieval nose-to-tail movement makes modern sustainable cuisine look wasteful by comparison. You pause at a stall where the vendor is selling something called umble pie, filled with the umbles or organ meats that nobles wouldn't touch, heart, liver, kidneys, and other internal bits get chopped up, heavily seasoned, and baked into pies for workers who can't afford proper muscle meat. This is where the phrase eating humble pie actually comes from, though the modern meaning of humiliation seems mild compared to actually having to eat the stuff. You take a cautious bite and immediately understand why medieval people were so obsessed with finding new spice trade routes. Here's the part that doesn't make it into most history books: the midnight meat runs. You follow a group of servants from a large household as they negotiate with vendors for bulk purchases of questionable meat products. These aren't the prime cuts their masters eat. This is servant food. Meat that's perfectly edible but would never grace a noble table. One vendor offers something he calls gathered meat, which appears to be scraps from various animals pressed together into a loaf. Medieval mystery meat at its finest, and the servants haggle over it like it's prime wagyu. The quality control methods are simultaneously hilarious and terrifying. Vendors swear on various saints that their meat is fresh, while customers employ tests that range from the practical, smelling for rot, to the superstitious, holding the meat up to see if it drips blood in the proper pattern. One old woman insists on bringing a cat to test the meat. Apparently, if the cat won't eat it, neither should humans. Given medieval cats' dietary standards, this seems like an incredibly low bar. You witness an entire underground economy built around meat that's traveling through its second or third incarnation. Butchers sell bones with a bit of meat still on to the poorest customers, who'll boil them for soup. Those bones then get sold again to glue makers or ground into meal for animals. Fat gets rendered and re-rendered, sold first for cooking, then for candles, then for waterproofing leather. Nothing, and I mean nothing, goes to waste. The meat pie vendors represent a special category of optimism. They cluster around the butcher stalls, buying up odds and ends to turn into fresh-baked offerings. You watch one negotiate for a bucket of mixed meats that the butcher diplomatically calls assorted. The pie maker doesn't even blink, mentally calculating how much pepper and sage it'll take to make this mystery meat palatable. These are the people who invented the phrase, "Don't ask what's in it, just enjoy it." Centuries before hot dogs made it famous, historians still argue whether medieval meat vendors were entrepreneurs making the best of limited refrigeration, or simply food poisoners with business licenses. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. You notice that locals seem to know which vendors to trust and which to avoid. Urban survival skills that predate Yelp reviews by several centuries. One vendor has clearly been sampling too much of his own questionable stock, swaying slightly as he assures customers his meat is blessed by the bishop himself, which seems unlikely unless the bishop has very low standards. As you leave the meat market, you can't help but admire the sheer audacity of it all. These vendors took products that modern food safety would condemn in seconds and turned them into a thriving economy. They fed thousands of workers daily with meat of wildly varying quality, creating a complex system of grades, prices, and carefully managed expectations that kept medieval London fed and only occasionally poisoned. You watch in amazement as a baker tears a steaming round loaf in half, scoops out some of the soft interior, and ladles bubbling stew directly into the hollow. He hands this edible bowl to a grateful dock worker who immediately starts spooning the contents into his mouth with the excavated bread bits. This isn't poverty cuisine. This is medieval engineering at its finest, solving the eternal problem of portable dining centuries before anyone dreamed of disposable plates. The bread bowl phenomenon represents one of those "why didn't I think of that" moments in food history. Every baker in the city seems to have their own variation. Some create deliberate hollows during baking, forming perfect soup vessels. Others use yesterday's bread, now hard enough to hold liquid without immediately dissolving into mush. You spot a vendor who specializes in coffin bread, extra thick crusted loaves specifically designed for holding wet foods. She's effectively running a medieval Panera, minus the Wi-Fi and with considerably more rat droppings. What really catches your attention is the elaborate hierarchy of bread-based food containers. Fresh, white bread bowls go to wealthier customers who can afford the luxury of eating their dinnerware. Working folks get bowls made from maslin bread, that heavy, mixed grain stuff that could double as a weapon in desperate times. The poorest customers receive hollowed-out trenchers of horse bread, a barely edible substance made from beans, bran, and whatever else was cheap that week. Even the containers have social classes in medieval England. You pause at a stall where an innovative baker has started what she calls sealed suppers. She fills a partially hollowed loaf with meat and vegetables, then uses the scooped-out bread mixed with egg to create a paste that seals the opening. The whole thing goes back in the oven until the seal hardens into an edible lid. Workers buy these in the morning and carry them all day. By evening, the bread has absorbed the meat juices, creating a self-marinating meal. It's basically a medieval Hot Pocket. If Hot Pockets were the size of your head and made with ingredients of questionable provenance. Here's the weird historical tidbit most people miss. Bread bowls weren't just about convenience. They were a form of payment. Many workers received part of their wages in bread, and turning that bread into a food container meant stretching those wages even further. You could buy cheap pottage or stew, and suddenly your payment bread becomes a full meal. Historians still argue whether employers deliberately paid in bread, knowing workers would need to buy filling, thereby creating a captive market for their other businesses. The bakers have developed an entire science around bread bowl construction. You watch a master baker instructing his apprentice on the proper crust-to-crumb ratio. Too much soft interior, and the bowl collapses. Too little, and the customer feels cheated. The ideal bread bowl should last through an entire meal without leaking, then be tasty enough to eat afterward. Some bakers add herbs directly to the dough, creating flavored bowls that complement specific fillings. Rosemary bowls for lamb stew, sage bowls for pork, and something called devil's bread, made with enough pepper to clear your sinuses, apparently popular with workers who've lost their sense of taste from years of eating questionable street food. You're particularly fascinated by the rental bowl system some taverns have developed. Can't afford a bread bowl? Rent a stale one for half the price. You eat the contents, return the bowl, and they fill it for the next customer. By the end of the day, these multi-use bowls have absorbed so many flavors, they've basically become a food item themselves. One tavern keeper proudly shows off bowls that have been in circulation for a week. Now so saturated with various stews, they could probably be classified as a new food group. The true genius emerges at a construction site where workers have turned bread bowls into a competitive sport. They judge whose bowl lasts longest, whose absorbs the most flavor, and who can eat theirs fastest without spilling. One legendary worker apparently ate nothing but bread bowls for a month, claiming it gave him the strength to lay twice as many stones. His colleagues suggest it more likely gave him the constipation of a lifetime. But everyone agrees his productivity did increase, possibly from the desperate need to finish work and find a privy. As night falls, you notice the bread bowl trade shifting. Late-night vendors offer double-walled bowls, essentially one bowl nested inside another for extra structural integrity. These are designed for drunk customers stumbling home from taverns who need maximum spill protection. The outer bowl might be made from horse bread so awful even starving dogs hesitate, but it serves its purpose as edible armor for the inner vessel. You recoil slightly as a vendor thrusts a clay pot toward your face, the contents bubbling with an enthusiasm that seems almost malevolent. Aged to perfection, she declares about something that smells like it died, came back to life, then died again. Welcome to the medieval world of fermented everything, where the line between preserved and poisonous was largely a matter of optimistic thinking and a strong stomach. The fermentation craze isn't just about alcohol, though Lord knows there's plenty of that. Every food stall seems to offer something that's been left to ripen in ways that would make a modern health inspector weep. Fermented fish paste, fermented cabbage, fermented milk products that have achieved a level of sentience just short of demanding voting rights. You watch a customer eagerly purchase what the vendor calls month-old cheese, though judging by the way it's trying to crawl out of its wrapping. Month might be a conservative estimate. What's genuinely fascinating is how fermentation accidentally created medieval energy drinks. You sample something called small beer porridge, basically fermented grains that haven't quite made it to full beer status, mixed with whatever else was lying around. The alcohol content is low enough that children drink it for breakfast, but high enough that everyone's slightly buzzed by mid-morning. One vendor explains that the fermentation process improves the humours, which is medieval speak for, we have no idea why this works, but people seem to like it. Here's the historical detail that rarely makes it into textbooks. Medieval people fermented foods as a form of nutritional enhancement without understanding the science. That sauerkraut-like substance piled on wooden boards. It's providing vitamin C to prevent scurvy. The fermented fish guts that smell like death's own perfume. Packed with nutrients that help workers survive on otherwise terrible diets. They thought they were just making food last longer, but they were accidentally creating superfoods. Disgusting, horrifying superfoods that could strip paint, but superfoods nonetheless. You stumble upon the fermented dairy section and immediately question all your life choices. A woman sells something she calls wisdom cheese, which has been aged in a cave until it developed its own ecosystem. She claims eating it provides visions, though you suspect the visions are just your body's way of processing the shock. Next to her, a man offers fermented butter that's been buried in a bog for 6 months. Gives it character, he says, which is certainly one way to describe something that smells like a swamp's armpit. The accidental alcohol situation reaches peak medieval when you discover fruit vendors selling very ripe produce. These fruits have fermented on their own, creating nature's own wine bottles. Workers buy overripe pears and apples specifically for the buzz, munching them during break time for a perfectly legal workday drink. One vendor has elevated this to an art form, carefully controlling the fermentation of his fruits to achieve specific alcohol levels. His Tuesday pears are mild, while his Friday apples could knock out a horse, but the real innovation happens at a stall selling fermented meat. Yes, you read that correctly. The vendor explains that hanging meat until it develops a specific type of mold creates incredible flavors, essentially medieval charcuterie. If charcuterie was made by people who thought food safety meant saying a prayer before eating, you watch customers carefully inspecting the mold patterns like sommeliers examining wine, debating whether the green spots indicate perfect aging or imminent death. Historians still argue whether medieval people had stronger stomachs or just lower life expectancies. The fermented beverage scene goes far beyond normal ale. You discover vendors selling fermented honey water, basically prison mead, fermented milk, kumis, brought by traders from the steppes, and something terrifying called cock ale, that allegedly contains an entire rooster fermented in beer. The vendor swears it's an aphrodisiac, though given the smell, it seems more likely to repel potential romantic partners into the next century. You're particularly intrigued by the communal fermentation vessels scattered throughout the market. Large clay pots sit in corners where anyone can add vegetable scraps, creating community ferments that belong to everyone and no one. People dip their bread into these communal pots, sharing bacteria and flavors in a way that would make modern germaphobes faint. It's either a beautiful example of medieval community spirit or a plague waiting to happen, possibly both. The economics of fermentation create their own bizarre marketplace. Starter cultures get passed down through families like heirlooms, sold and traded like precious commodities. You watch an old woman carefully portion out spoonfuls of her sourdough starter, each one commanding prices that seem insane for what amounts to flour and bacteria. But buyers treat these starters with reverence, knowing they carry decades of flavor development and probably several unknown species of microorganisms. You dodge a flying fish head as two vendors scream at each other in the middle of Cheapside, their argument drawing a crowd of amused onlookers and one very frustrated market inspector trying to restore order. The fish vendor weighs what he claims is a perfectly good eel that appears to have died during the reign of the previous king, while his accuser insists she saw him painting fresh blood on week-old mackerel to make it look newly caught. Welcome to the dark underbelly of medieval food safety, where regulations exist but enforcement is basically a suggestion with occasional fines. The food safety scandals of medieval times make modern recalls look quaint. You watch as an alewife gets dragged to the pillory for watering down her beer, not because it's dishonest, but because she watered it with Thames River water that contained enough human waste to qualify as a biological weapon. The crowd pelts her with rotten vegetables, which seems ironic given that those vegetables are probably safer than half the food being sold in the market. Medieval justice has a twisted sense of humor. Here's what the history books rarely mention: the elaborate schemes vendors develop to hide spoiled food. You spot a baker carefully inserting fresh dough around moldy centers, creating what he'll sell as fresh loaves. A butcher rubs salt and herbs on meat that's turned green, masking both the color and smell. Most disturbing, a pie maker appears to be recycling yesterday's unsold pies by breaking them up and mixing the filling into new ones. A medieval perpetual pie machine that would horrify anyone who understood germ theory. The regulations themselves are fascinatingly specific and utterly bizarre. Bakers who sell underweight loaves get dragged through the streets with the offending bread hung around their necks. Brewers who make bad ale have to drink their own product until they vomit, which, given medieval ale quality, probably doesn't take long. You witness a fishmonger getting fined for selling stinking fish, though the judge has to get within 3 feet to determine if the smell crosses from normal fish stench to illegally putrid. What's genuinely remarkable is the underground network of food forgers. Yes, medieval people faked food like modern counterfeiters fake money. You discover vendors selling bread made primarily from sawdust and chalk, cheese that's mostly tallow and flour painted yellow, and wine that started life as vinegar mixed with berries and lead. Yes, lead for sweetness. One enterprising criminal has been caught selling pepper that's actually dried mud mixed with charcoal. The profit margins on fake spices are apparently worth the risk of pillorying. The meat substitution rackets reach levels of creativity that would impress modern crime syndicates. Horse meat masquerades as beef, dog as mutton, and cat as rabbit. Though given medieval palates, many customers probably can't tell the difference. You overhear whispers about one butcher who got caught selling griffin steaks, which turned out to be old horse meat marketed to gullible nobles who wanted to eat mythical creatures. He made a fortune before someone realized griffins don't exist and probably wouldn't taste like expired cavalry mounts if they did. But the real scandal erupts at the bakery guild meeting you stumble into. Bakers are arguing about the common practice of adding bean flour, chalk, and even ground bones to stretch wheat flour. The guildmaster insists these additives are traditional, while younger bakers worry about customers dying, not from moral concerns, but because dead customers don't buy bread. The debate reveals an entire industry built on adulterating food, with recipe books that read more like chemistry experiments than cooking instructions. Historians still argue whether medieval food scandals were worse than modern ones or just more visible. The punishment happens in public. You watch a wine merchant forced to drink his own adulterated product in the town square, while the crowd jeers. His wine contains enough added sugar of lead to make him violently ill, which serves as both punishment and public health announcement. Medieval Facebook would have been wild. The corruption goes all the way to the top. You discover that market inspectors often take bribes in the form of food, the very food they're supposed to be inspecting. One inspector has developed a sophisticated rating system. 1 pie means he'll look the other way. 2 pies means he'll warn you before official inspections. And 3 pies means he'll testify that your rotten fish smelled like roses blessed by angels. It's a protection racket run entirely on questionable meat products. As night falls, the black market for banned foods emerges. Vendors whisper about special meat that definitely isn't from diseased animals. Fresh fish that certainly wasn't caught during the previous king's reign. And bread made with only the finest sawdust. The authorities conduct raids, but vendors have developed elaborate warning systems, children stationed as lookouts, secret compartments in carts, and code words that would make modern drug dealers proud. Who knew medieval food crime required so much organization? You crouch behind a hedgerow at dawn, watching field workers emerge from their hovels like medieval zombies, shuffling toward another day of back-breaking labor. But what catches your attention isn't their exhaustion. It's the small wooden stalls that pop up along the field edges like mushrooms after rain. These makeshift convenience stores cater to agricultural workers who left home before sunrise and won't return until after dark, creating a mobile food economy that follows the harvest. The stallkeepers are usually farmers' wives or elderly villagers who figured out that exhausted workers will pay premium prices for not having to pack their own meals. You watch one woman set up her entire operation from a wheelbarrow, pre-made pottage in clay pots wrapped in hay for insulation, rough bread that could double as a weapon, weak ale in leather skins, and something she optimistically calls cheese that looks more like compressed disappointment. She's positioned perfectly at the field entrance, catching workers who forgot breakfast in their pre-dawn stumble toward feudal obligations. What's brilliant about these pop-up food stalls is their scheduling. They appear at precise times: dawn for breakfast stragglers, mid-morning for second breakfast. Yes, hobbits didn't invent that. Noon for dinner, and late afternoon for the meal that gets workers through until sunset. The vendors know exactly when energy flags and stomachs growl. One enterprising woman has even started offering wake-up drafts, essentially medieval energy drinks made from fermented herbs and enough alcohol to make the day seem slightly less miserable. Here's the detail that doesn't make it into pastoral medieval fantasies. The credit system these fieldside vendors developed was more sophisticated than some modern financial instruments. Workers who wouldn't see bekise, actual coins, until harvest's end could eat on credit, with debts recorded on tally sticks. But the interest rates would make loan sharks blush. Borrow the value of a penny loaf in planting season, owe 2 pennies by harvest. The vendors justify this as risk management, since workers might die, flee, or simply have a bad harvest. Medieval subprime lending. Basically, you're fascinated by the specialized foods developed specifically for field workers. Noon cakes are dense, portable bread stuffed with whatever protein was available, usually beans or the kind of meat that required extensive prayer before consumption. Harvest pies contain extra salt to replace what workers sweat out, though the salt often comes from preserved fish so old it's achieved a kind of immortality. One vendor sells strength soup, which appears to be hot water with floating mysteries and enough pepper to mask the taste of whatever died in it. The mobile nature of these operations creates its own comedy. You watch vendors literally race to the best spots, wheelbarrows bouncing over rutted paths, precious pottage sloshing everywhere. 2 elderly women get into a slapping fight over a prime position near the well, while their respective pottages slowly congeal into something resembling edible cement. The younger vendors have started hiring children as runners, sending them ahead to claim spots like medieval food truck territories. But what really catches your attention is the barter economy that flourishes around these stalls. Cash-poor workers trade everything: gleaned grains, poached rabbits. Everyone pretends not to notice the Lord's property. Herbs gathered from the forest. Even promises of future labor. One vendor has accumulated such a complex web of IOUs that she essentially owns half the village's future productivity. She's become a medieval venture capitalist, funded entirely by questionable pottage and strategic positioning. The hygiene situation at these field stalls makes regular medieval food safety look positively pristine. Vendors serve food with the same hands they use to handle money, tally sticks, and occasionally discipline unruly customers. Flies form clouds around the food thick enough to cast shadows. One vendor's cat sleeps directly in the bread basket, adding its own special garnish to every loaf. When you point this out, she shrugs and notes that the cat keeps the rats away, which is medieval logic at its finest. Yes, there are rats, but at least they're not in the bread with the cat. Historians still argue whether these fieldside food stalls represented entrepreneurial innovation or exploitation of desperate workers. The truth, as you observe, is probably both. The vendors provide a genuine service, saving workers time and energy, but they also charge prices that would make urban food vendors blush, knowing their customers have no alternatives. It's capitalism in its rawest form, conducted over bubbling pots of gruel. As the day progresses, you notice the food quality declining precipitously. Morning pottage at least pretended to contain vegetables. By afternoon, it's basically hot water with memories of nutrition. The bread gets harder, the ale gets thinner, and that cheese somehow gets even more depressing. But the workers keep buying, because the alternative is fainting in the fields or taking time they don't have to walk home for food. The vendors know this and price accordingly. It's supply, demand, and desperation in perfect medieval harmony. You push through the crowds at Stourbridge Fair, one of Europe's largest medieval festivals, where the normal rules of commerce and cuisine have been temporarily suspended in favor of complete chaos. The smell hits you first, an overwhelming mixture of roasting meats, spilled ale, human sweat, and something that might be either exotic spices or someone's shoe burning. Food vendors pack the fairground like edible sardines, each screaming louder than their neighbors about their miraculous offerings. The fair food makes regular medieval street food look positively gourmet. Here, innovation means finding new ways to combine grease, dubious meat, and whatever fell off a merchant's wagon. You watch a vendor proudly displaying dragon eggs, which turn out to be regular eggs wrapped in sausage meat and fried until they achieve a truly alarming color. Next to him, someone sells unicorn horns, which are just twisted bread dough with enough salt to preserve a corpse. Shaped vaguely like spirals and marketed to drunk fairgoers who've temporarily lost their critical thinking skills. What's genuinely remarkable is the international food court that spontaneously forms. Merchants from across Europe and beyond bring their local specialties, creating combinations that would horrify their grandmothers. A German vendor sells sauerkraut-stuffed pies to confused English customers who can't understand why anyone would ferment cabbage on purpose. An Italian merchant offers what he claims is genuine Roman pasta, though it looks suspiciously like the local wheat strips everyone's been eating forever. A trader from the Far East tries to explain the concept of spiced wine to locals who think adding anything to alcohol besides more alcohol is basically heresy. You stumble upon the gaming area where food becomes entertainment. Pie-eating contests draw huge crowds, with competitors racing to consume meat pies that would challenge modern competitive eaters. The twist? Medieval pies are basically edible concrete, and contestants frequently crack teeth in their enthusiasm. There's also Guess the Meat, a horrifying game where blindfolded participants try to identify what animal they're eating. Given medieval meat ambiguity, this game has no real winners, only survivors. Here's what historians often miss about medieval fair food. It was the testing ground for culinary innovations that either became traditions or thankfully died out. You witness someone attempting to sell portable soup, essentially boiled bones reduced to a hard jelly that travelers can reconstitute with hot water. It's actually not a terrible idea, except the vendor hasn't quite mastered the preservation part, and several blocks have developed their own fuzzy ecosystems. Another entrepreneur offers perpetual bread, which allegedly never goes stale. The secret? It started out so hard that staleness would actually be an improvement. The drinking food innovations are particularly alarming. Vendors compete to create the most potent combinations of alcohol and sustenance. Cock ale makes another appearance, but now it's joined by beaver tail brew. Supposedly contains actual beaver, definitely contains something that died. Bishop's blessing, wine mixed with eggs and cream that looks like something a bishop would need last rites after drinking. And sailor's salvation, rum mixed with anything that didn't run away fast enough. The goal seems to be creating drinks that simultaneously feed you and make you forget what you just consumed. The temporary nature of fairs creates a fascinating economy of disposable food containers. Since merchants can't haul pottery across Europe, they develop increasingly creative serving solutions. Bread bowls reach new heights of engineering, some reinforced with egg whites to create essentially edible ceramic. Leaves get pressed into service as plates. Though the type of leaf seems randomly selected, you watch someone trying to eat hot stew off what appears to be poison ivy. The real innovation is food cups, hollowed vegetables filled with drink, so you can eat your cup after downing your ale. efficiency that would make modern environmentalists weep with joy. You're particularly intrigued by the fair's midnight market, which opens after official trading ends. This is where the real experimental cuisine happens. Vendors who've been drinking their own products all day start combining ingredients with the reckless abandon of medieval mad scientists. So, you witness the birth of what might be the world's first fusion cuisine. Germanic sausages wrapped in Arabic flatbread, covered in French cheese, and topped with something that might be English vegetables, or possibly just garnish that achieves sentience. The fair also showcases regional competitiveness through food. Different guilds and towns set up stalls specifically to prove their version of common foods is superior. You watch representatives from 3 different cities argue about whose meat pie is the true pie, each claiming recipes dating back to King Arthur, despite pies probably being invented last Tuesday. The Yorkshire pudding contingent gets into an actual fistfight with the Lancashire lobby over the proper consistency of batter. Food nationalism at its finest, conducted by people who can't even agree on what constitutes meat. You creep through the darkened monastery corridors well past Compline, following the soft shuffle of sandaled feet and the unmistakable clink of pottery. The Holy Brothers of St. Bartholomew's are supposedly deep in prayer or virtuous sleep. But you've discovered the worst-kept secret in medieval Christianity. Monks eat better than nobles, and their midnight snacking habits would scandalize the Pope himself, if he weren't probably doing the same thing in Rome. Brother Francis, the cellarer, pretends not to notice as half the monastery files through his domain between matins and lauds. Officially, the rule of St. Benedict allows only 2 meals a day, with fasting prescribed for numerous holy days. Unofficially, the brothers have developed more loopholes than a lawyer's contract. Collation, they call it, a light reading accompanied by equally light refreshment. Somehow, this light refreshment has evolved into full-blown midnight feasts, featuring everything from honey cakes to meat pies that technically contain fish because someone once saw a fish near the cow. The monastic kitchen after dark transforms into a medieval speakeasy. You watch Brother Thomas, officially on prayer vigil, expertly assembling what can only be described as a medieval sandwich, thick slabs of bread, cheese that cost more than a peasant's monthly wages, preserved meats that definitely came from 4-legged creatures despite being labelled barnacle goose. Apparently barnacle geese grow on trees, making them vegetables, making them acceptable during fasts. Medieval logic at its finest. He adds a layer of exotic preserve made from quinces and spices that arrived on merchant ships from the Holy Land, creating a combination that would make modern food bloggers weep with envy. Here's what the historical records conveniently forget. Monasteries were the test kitchens of the medieval world. With access to extensive herb gardens, international trade connections through religious networks, and, crucially, literate members who could write down recipes, monks accidentally invented half of what we now consider traditional European cuisine. You spot a brother experimenting with what appears to be an early form of mustard, grinding seeds with vinegar and honey while muttering about improving digestion to justify his culinary chemistry. The midnight brewing operations particularly fascinate you. While secular brewers focus on quantity and basic preservation, monastic brewers pursue perfection, with the dedication usually reserved for illuminating manuscripts. Brother Augustine shows you his secret stash of medicinal ales, each flavored with different herbs and aged in casks that cost more than village churches. He's particularly proud of something called cocklebread ale, which apparently involves bread baked by women sitting on it, don't ask, and creates effects that seem more appropriate for a brothel than a brotherhood. The food storage systems in monasteries put modern preppers to shame. Vast undercrofts hold wheels of cheese aging to perfection, barrels of preserved everything, and dried goods that could survive the second coming. But the midnight snackers have developed an entire secondary system. Hidden stashes in cells, secret compartments in the library, and what can only be described as a snack black market where younger brothers trade manual labor for extra portions of the good preserves. You watch a novice exchange 3 days of extra garden work for a single honey cake, and honestly, given the cake's appearance, he might have gotten the better deal. What's particularly amusing is the theological gymnastics performed to justify these midnight indulgences. St. Augustine himself said we must nourish the body to serve the soul, argues one portly brother, while assembling his third light collation of the night. Another cites obscure saints who apparently survive solely on prayer and whatever happened to be in the kitchen after dark. The prior, who should be enforcing fasting rules, has developed selective blindness that coincidentally flares up whenever he passes the kitchen after midnight. The international nature of monastic orders creates surprising fusion cuisine. A visiting brother from Italy has introduced something called pasta to the midnight kitchen, creating unholy combinations with English cheese and preserved fish that would horrify both cultures. German brothers contribute their suspicious fermented vegetables, while Irish monks insist everything improves with more butter. The resulting midnight meals resemble diplomatic incidents more than religious experiences. Historians still argue whether medieval monasteries were centers of gluttony or gustatory innovation. The truth, as you observe, is magnificently both. These midnight snackers aren't just breaking fasts, they're advancing food science. That brother sneaking honey-preserved fruits, he's accidentally discovering techniques that won't be officially invented for centuries. The one mixing wines with herbs for health reasons, he's creating liqueurs that will eventually fund entire monasteries. Even their guilt-driven creativity, finding ways to make forbidden foods technically permitted, drives culinary innovation. As Lord's approaches and the brothers scurry back to their cells, carefully brushing crumbs from their robes, you realize you've witnessed something profound. These midnight monastery snacks aren't just about hungry monks cheating their vows. They're about humans finding joy and creativity even within strict religious constraints. Every illicit honey cake represents a small rebellion against austerity, a delicious reminder that even those who've renounced worldly pleasures can't quite give up the simple joy of a good midnight snack. You join a merchant caravan preparing to depart London for York, and the food preparation resembles a military operation more than a shopping trip. Merchants aren't just packing goods to sell. They're loading up on portable meals that need to survive a 2-week journey through roads that barely deserve the name, weather that seems personally offended by travelers, and the ever-present possibility of being robbed by bandits who are probably hungrier than they are greedy. The innovation starts with what merchants call journey bread, a horrifying creation that makes ship's biscuit look appetizing. You watch a baker specifically preparing these travel loaves, pounding the dough until it achieves the consistency of edible leather, then baking it until it could deflect arrows. The result defies conventional definitions of food, but it'll last months without spoiling, mainly because even mold finds it too challenging to colonize. One merchant demonstrates the proper eating technique: soak it in ale, wine, or if desperate, puddle water until it softens enough that human teeth can make an impression. What's fascinating is the portable preservation techniques merchants have developed. One shows you his collection of pocket meats, strips of beef dried until they resemble leather, then rolled tight and sealed with fat. He can carry a month's worth of protein in a pouch the size of your fist. Another merchant specializes in travel cheese, which has been aged and waxed until it achieves the hardness of stone. Could brain a bandit with this, he notes proudly, demonstrating its dual purpose as food and weapon. You discover an entire underground economy of travel food specialists in London. These aren't regular food vendors. They're expedition outfitters who understand the specific needs of long-distance travel. One woman has perfected journey pottage powder, essentially medieval instant soup, dried peas, beans, and unidentifiable vegetables ground together with enough salt to preserve a mammoth, packed in leather pouches. Just add hot water and pray. Another vendor sells traveler's joy, which turns out to be fermented fish paste mixed with herbs and sealed in pig bladders. The smell could clear a congested road faster than any town crier. Here's the historical detail that rarely makes it into romantic tales of medieval merchants. The mathematical precision of travel food planning. Merchants calculate calories per pound with the accuracy of modern nutritionists, balancing weight against sustenance. You watch a spice merchant agonizing over whether to pack an extra pound of dried fruit or save the weight for more profitable cargo. His solution? Convince other merchants to trade food throughout the journey, creating a mobile market where a handful of almonds might fetch prices that would shock stationary vendors. The drink situation presents unique challenges. Water sources along medieval roads range from questionable to actively hostile to human life. Merchants pack leather bottles of ale and wine, but weight limits mean careful rationing. The real innovation comes from a merchant who's developed solid ale, basically beer reduced to a paste and mixed with grain. Add water, wait, and you get something that technically qualifies as alcoholic beverage, though taste wasn't apparently a design consideration. Another traveler carries wine stones, crystallized wine residue that can be reconstituted. It tastes like someone's memory of wine filtered through regret, but it's safer than most water sources. The communal eating arrangements on the road create their own culture. Merchants pool resources for hot meals when they stop, creating traveling feast halls around campfires. You witness elaborate negotiations. 2 strips of dried meat for a handful of nuts. A cup of wine for a share of someone's miraculously fresh onion. The merchant who thought to pack dried herbs becomes king of the camp, able to trade pinches of flavor for substantial meals. It's capitalism at its most basic, conducted over bubbling pots of whatever everyone could contribute. But the real genius emerges in the emergency foods merchants hide throughout their wagons. After the obvious supplies run low, they start producing hidden stashes, dried fruits sewn into clothing linings, nuggets of hard cheese tucked into boot heels, even edible wax seals that can be consumed if desperate. One merchant shows you his famine buttons, made from compressed grains and tallow, sewn onto his coat like decorations. In extremis, he can eat his wardrobe. Historians still argue whether medieval travel food represents human ingenuity or desperation. Watching these merchants, you realize it's both. Every unappetizing preserved horror in their packs represents generations of trial and error, of travelers who didn't pack enough, pack right, or pack foods that survived the journey. The successful merchants are the ones whose ancestors figured out that sugar of lead makes things taste sweet, but kills you, that some dried meats last longer than others, and that hunger makes even journey bread seem acceptable. As the caravan finally departs, you notice each merchant performing small rituals over their food supplies, prayers, signs against evil. Even what appears to be someone trying to bribe their dried meat into lasting longer. The road ahead stretches uncertain and hostile, but they've got their portable calories, their reconstitutable drinks, and their emergency buttons. It's not haute cuisine, but it'll get them there, probably. You enter the great market square of Nottingham at midday, and it's like stepping into a medieval food court designed by someone with attention deficit disorder and a sadistic sense of humour. The cacophony hits you first. Hundreds of vendors shouting in at least 12 different dialects, animals complaining about their impending transformation into dinner, and the occasional crash of pottery when negotiations get too heated. But beyond the chaos, you're witnessing something remarkable, the birth of organized food commerce that would seem surprisingly familiar to anyone who's navigated a modern shopping mall's food court. The organization, such as it is, follows a logic that would make urban planners weep. Butchers cluster in one corner, follow your nose and the flies. Bakers dominate another section, follow the slightly less offensive smells. While fishmongers occupy the area closest to the drainage channels for obvious and disgusting reasons between these major groups, smaller vendors squeeze into every available space like edible Tetris pieces. A woman selling suspicious dairy products has wedged her stall between two ale vendors, creating an alcoholic sandwich with a cheese filling. What's genuinely fascinating is the unwritten rules governing these medieval food courts. Prime spots near the main entrances cost more, not in rent, but in bribes to market officials and protection money to local gangs who've decided that food distribution is their calling. You watch a new vendor try to set up in a choice location, only to be encouraged to move by three large men who explain the concept of seniority with their fists. Medieval commercial real estate, location, and not getting beaten up. The social dynamics create their own entertainment. You notice customers develop regular routes through the market, visiting their trusted vendors in specific orders. Mrs. Pemberton always starts at John the Baker, moves to William the Butcher, carefully avoids Margaret the fishwife, something about a dispute over a mackerel 3 years ago, and ends at Alice the alewife. These routes become so established that vendors time their freshest offerings to their regular customers' arrival. It's customer loyalty programs, medieval style. Here's what historians often miss. These markets function as information exchanges as much as food courts. While buying your questionable meat pie, you learn that the miller's daughter ran off with a travelling minstrel, the lord's planning new taxes, and someone definitely saw a two-headed calf born in the next village. The food vendors are medieval social media, spreading news, gossip, and outright lies with every transaction. One particularly clever pie seller has realized she can charge premium prices if she includes exclusive gossip with each purchase. The food quality varies wildly within the same market, creating a bizarre democracy of dining. A wealthy merchant haggles over exotic spices next to a labourer buying week-old bread. The same vendor might offer gentleman's cheese, aged properly, only slightly mouldy, and working cheese, best not to ask questions. You watch customers perform elaborate inspection rituals, sniffing, poking, occasionally licking, while vendors swear on various saints that their products are fresh. The saints, presumably, are too busy to fact-check these claims. The entertainment value reaches peak medieval when disputes arise. You witness a full-scale brawl break out over whether a chicken was sold fresh or frozen. Medieval frozen, meaning it died last winter and spent the intervening months in someone's cold cellar. The market court convenes right there. with the bailiff trying to maintain order while dodging thrown vegetables. Justice is swift, public, and often involves the offending food item. A baker caught selling underweight loaves has to wear them around his neck while customers pelt him with his own products. It's dinner and a show. The seasonal changes in these markets create their own dramas. Spring brings the first fresh vegetables, treated like celebrities returning from exile. Customers actually applaud when the first asparagus appears. Summer sees fruit vendors engaged in cutthroat competition over who has the sweetest strawberries. Autumn brings preservation panic as everyone tries to stock up for winter. And winter itself transforms the market into a grim battlefield, where vendors guard their dwindling supplies like medieval golems, protecting their precious root vegetables. Historians still argue whether medieval markets were efficiently organized or barely controlled chaos. The answer, as you observe, is yes. The chaos has its own efficiency, the organization its own madness. Regular customers navigate the confusion with practiced ease, while newcomers stand bewildered, clutching their coins and wondering why that woman is trying to sell them a fish that's clearly planning its own funeral. As afternoon fades, the market transforms again. Vendors, desperate to avoid carrying stock home, start the medieval equivalent of flash sales. Everything must go takes on new meaning when everything includes meat, of dubious providence, and bread that could double as building material. The last hour before closing resembles a capitalist feeding frenzy, with customers gambling on whether those bargain prices are worth the risk of food poisoning. It's Black Friday meets the Black Death, conducted daily in market squares across medieval England. You follow your nose through the servants' entrance of a great lord's castle just as the feast ends, entering a world where yesterday's noble excess transforms into today's street economy. The great hall's detritus, picked over peacock carcasses, trenchers soaked with gravy, mysterious subtleties that look better than they tasted, all flow through the kitchen like a river of opportunity. What happens next would make modern food recycling programs look wastefully inefficient. The pecking order for leftovers resembles a complex feudal system in miniature. First come the high-ranking servants, who've already secreted choice morsels during service. You watch the steward carefully wrapping slices of venison in cloth, officially for the dogs, but destined for his own family's table. Next, the kitchen staff claim their traditional rights. The cook gets first pick of anything that returned uneaten, while scullery maids fight over trencher bread soaked with noble gravies. By the time food reaches the lower servants, it's been picked over more thoroughly than a battlefield by crows. What's genuinely remarkable is the speed of transformation. Within hours of the feast ending, those same leftovers appear in the town market, miraculously transformed into fresh offerings. That magnificent roasted swan centerpiece. It's now definitely chicken pieces sold by the castle's undergroom's wife. The elaborate subtlety made of marchpane and sugar, broken into fragments and sold as angel sweets to children who'll never know they're eating a sugar sculpture of the Lord's heraldic achievements. Even the decorative herbs get swept up, dried, and sold as blessed seasonings from his lordship's own table. Here's the dirty secret historians rarely discuss. The entire medieval feast system depended on this leftover economy. Lords knew perfectly well that ordering 20 roasted capons for 10 guests meant feeding half the town by proxy. It was a form of charity that maintained their dignity. They weren't giving handouts to the poor. They were simply wasteful enough that industrious servants could build entire businesses on their excess. You watch a notorious local pie maker negotiating with the undercook for a barrel of mixed meats, already calculating how many fresh rabbit pies she can produce from what's obviously the remains of 6 different animals. The creativity in repurposing feast leftovers reaches levels that would inspire modern molecular gastronomy. Meat gets stripped from bones, mixed with grains, formed into new shapes, and sold as entirely different animals. Sauces get watered down and rebottled as Lord's blessing condiments. Even the bones don't escape. They're sold to make broths, then ground for meal, then finally burned for fuel. One enterprising merchant has developed what he calls twice blessed bread made from the crumbs of noble trenchers mixed with new flour. Customers believe it carries some residual nobility, possibly improving their social standing through digestion. The timing creates its own underground market. Servants who know when feasts are scheduled become information brokers, selling details to food vendors who position themselves strategically. You witness what can only be described as medieval insider trading. A kitchen maid's cousin suddenly has a stall full of fresh capons the morning after a wedding feast. The correlation is obvious to everyone, but the fiction must be maintained. These aren't leftovers. They're entirely new foods that just happen to appear whenever the castle entertains. But the real innovation happens in the preservation rush. Feast leftovers won't last long, even by medieval standards. So vendors develop speed processing techniques that would impress modern industrial food producers. You watch a team of women work through a pile of roasted meats, salting, smoking, and potting with the efficiency of a Detroit assembly line. Within 4 hours, a feast's worth of perishable luxury has been transformed into preserved goods that'll last weeks. They're essentially running a medieval cannery, powered by gossip and righteous efficiency. The social implications fascinate you even more than the food recycling. That merchant's wife proudly serving Lord's meat at her table. She knows it's leftovers. Her guests know it's leftovers. But everyone participates in the fiction that they're dining like nobility. It's aspirational eating at its finest. You might not be able to afford fresh venison, but you can afford venison that a duke already took one bite from. In a society obsessed with hierarchy, these leftovers provide a unique form of social mobility, even if it's just gastronomical. Historians still argue whether this leftover economy represented efficient resource use or systemic inequality. Watching the transformation of feast remains into street food, you realize it's both and neither. It's a system that feeds people who'd otherwise go hungry, provides income for enterprising vendors, and maintains social hierarchies while simultaneously subverting them. Every repackaged peacock, every recycled sauce, every twice-blessed trencher represents medieval society's ability to turn waste into sustenance, excess into economy, and yesterday's noble feast into today's common meal. You squeeze through a narrow alley behind Cheapside as midnight approaches, following whispered directions to what locals call Sugar Alice's place. The building looks abandoned, but a small mark on the door, a bee carved into the wood, tells those in the know that inside waits medieval England's most dangerous addiction, sugar. In an age when a pound of sugar costs more than a labourer's monthly wages, the sweet tooth of the wealthy has created a black market that makes modern drug dealing look positively wholesome. Inside, the scene resembles a medieval speakeasy crossed with Willy Wonka's fever dream. Alice herself, a woman who learned confectionery arts from Moorish traders, presides over bubbling pots of concentrated sweetness. She's cooking sugar into forms that the guild authorities definitely haven't approved. Clear syrups that can be hidden in false-bottom bottles, hard candies that dissolve slowly on the tongue, and most illegally. Pure white sugar refined far beyond what customs officials claim is possible. Her clients include nobles' wives sneaking out in servants' clothes, wealthy merchants who've developed what they shamefully call the sweet sickness, and even a priest who swears the sugar is for communion purposes. The sugar smuggling routes read like medieval spy novels. You learn that boats arrive at night in small coves, carrying precious cargo from Venice and beyond. The sugar comes hidden in flour barrels, sewn into the linings of cloth bolts, even dissolved in wine and later recrystallized. One smuggler shows you hollow walking sticks filled with pure cane sugar, worth more than the gold rings on his fingers. The penalties for sugar smuggling are severe: pillory, fines, even imprisonment. But the profits make the risk worthwhile. A single successful run can set up a family for years. Here's what official histories don't tell you. The medieval sugar black market created its own subculture. Sweet shops operate behind legitimate businesses, accessible only through hidden doors and code words. You watch customers develop elaborate signals. Ordering bitter ale with blessed herbs means you want your regular sugar fix. The addiction is real. Wealthy merchants arrange their travel schedules around their dealers' availability. One lord's wife confesses she's pawned family jewels to maintain her marchpane habit. But sugar is just the beginning. The honey cake underground operates parallel to, but separate from the sugar trade. While sugar is for the wealthy, honey cakes democratize sweetness for the masses. You discover bakeries that operate only at night, their ovens producing honey-sweetened breads and cakes that technically violate guild regulations on sweetener use. The bakers have developed a complex warning system, children stationed as lookouts, special whistles that alert everyone to approaching inspectors, hidden compartments where illegal honey stores disappear at a moment's notice. The spice smuggling adds another layer of criminality. Pepper, worth its weight in silver, gets cut with dried berries and sold to unsuspecting customers. Saffron, so valuable it has its own special court for prosecuting fraud, gets extended with marigold petals and turmeric. You witness a deal for genuine nutmeg that involves more security than a royal treasury transfer. Tasters verify authenticity. Weights are checked and triple-checked. And payment happens through intermediaries to prevent anyone from knowing the full supply chain. What's particularly fascinating is the medical angle these dealers use to justify their trade. Sugar isn't just a luxury, it's medicine. Physicians prescribe it for everything from melancholy to plague. One dealer shows you his collection of medical texts, proving that sugar cures impotence, extends life, and sharpens the mind. His clients desperately want to believe these claims, paying astronomical prices for sugar pills that are basically medieval placebos. The fact that they're delicious placebos only helps sales. The innovation in concealment reaches absurd levels. You encounter sugar monks, men dressed as religious brothers who smuggle sweets in fake prayer book boxes. There are candy nurses who hide treats in swaddling clothes while pretending to carry babies. One enterprising criminal has trained ravens to fly sugar packets across city walls, though the birds occasionally sample the merchandise. The authorities know these tricks, but can't keep up. For every smuggler caught, 10 more devise new methods. Historians still argue whether the medieval sugar black market represents early capitalism or just organized crime with better taste. The truth encompasses both. These dealers aren't just selling sweetness, they're selling status, medicine, pleasure, and addiction wrapped in honey and lies. Every illegal honey cake represents defiance of guild monopolies. Every smuggled sugar loaf challenges royal tax collectors. Every secret sweet shop undermines the official economy while creating its own. As dawn approaches and the sweet shops close their hidden doors, you realize you've witnessed the birth of consumer culture. These medieval dealers understood what legitimate merchants wouldn't admit for centuries, that people will pay anything for pleasure, that addiction drives commerce, and that the best businesses sell not just products but dreams. In this case, dreams that taste of honey and sugar, dissolve on the tongue, and leave customers craving more despite the risk to both purse and reputation. You sprint through the narrow streets of medieval London, following a young boy who clutches a steaming pot wrapped in straw, dodging carts, horses, and the occasional flying chamber pot contents. This is young Tom, one of the city's food runners, and he's racing to deliver hot pottage from the cookshop on Bread Street to a merchant's counting house near the Thames. If the food arrives cold, he doesn't get paid. If he spills it, the cost comes from his meager earnings. Welcome to the birth of medieval meal delivery, where your DoorDash driver might be 8 years old and barefoot. The system that's emerging in London's twisted streets would seem surprisingly familiar to anyone who's ever tracked a food delivery app. Wealthy merchants and noble households, too busy or too important to fetch their own meals, employ networks of runners who know every shortcut, every loose cobblestone, every aggressive dog between the cookshops and their destinations. These children, and they're almost always children, being faster and able to squeeze through crowds, have mapped the city in ways that would impress modern logistics companies. What's remarkable is the technology these medieval delivery services have developed. Special carrying poles balance multiple containers, letting runners transport several orders at once. Insulated boxes made from wood and lined with straw keep food warm for precious extra minutes. Some runners have even developed primitive numbering systems, chalking symbols on containers to track which order goes where, essentially inventing order tracking 5 centuries before computers. You watch one enterprising runner who's modified a small cart with wooden wheels, wrapped in cloth for quiet. Smooth delivery through sleeping neighborhoods. Here's the historical detail that rarely makes it into the records. The runner guilds, yes. These food delivery children have organized. They've divided the city into territories, established fair pricing, and even created a primitive insurance system where runners contribute farthings to support any member injured on the job. The guild meets in a burnt-out cellar near Cheapside, where veteran runners, grizzled 12-year-olds who've survived 5 whole years in the business, train newcomers on optimal routes and customer management. The client relationships these runners develop border on the intimate. They know that Master Henderson wants his pie extra hot and will tip an extra farthing for speed. Mistress Cooper prefers her ale delivered to the back door, to avoid her husband knowing about her midday drinking. The notary on Milk Street pays in advance, but docks payment for any spillage. So runners save his orders for their steadiest carriers. It's customer relationship management, conducted by illiterate children who nonetheless understand service economics better than some modern MBAs. But the real innovation happens with the cookshops themselves. Realizing that delivery orders provide steady income without requiring dining space. Some establishments have gone delivery only. They operate from tiny kitchens in basements and back alleys, producing food specifically designed for transport. Their traveling pies have extra thick crust to survive the journey. Their potages include binding agents, usually extra sweet, to prevent sloshing. One innovative cook has started pre-packaging individual portions in dried bread bowls. creating the medieval equivalent of a combo meal. The timing systems fascinate you most. Without clocks, runners developed their own methods for coordinating deliveries. Some use church bells as markers, knowing they need to deliver to the lawyer's office between sext and none. Others navigate by shadow length, understanding that when the cathedral shadow reaches the baker's shop, the merchant's guild expects their lunch. The most experienced runners develop internal timing that rivals atomic clocks, able to estimate travel time across the city within minutes. Competition between delivery services creates its own drama. You witness a turf war between runners from rival cookshops, conducted entirely through sabotage and strategic route blocking. One team spreads oil on cobblestones to slow competitors. Another creates false traffic jams using Confederates with conveniently broken carts. There's even industrial espionage. Runners who memorize competitors' recipes by smell and report back to their employers. It's capitalism read in tooth and claw. If capitalism wore patched tunics and ran barefoot through horse manure, historians still argue whether medieval food delivery represented entrepreneurial innovation or child exploitation. Watching these runners, you see it's unquestionably both. These children work brutal hours for minimal pay, risking injury and illness with every delivery, but they're also learning business skills, building networks, and occasionally rising from runners to cookshop owners themselves. Every successful delivery represents a tiny victory against medieval England's rigid class system. As the sun sets over London's cramped streets, the evening delivery rush begins. Tired workers flood cookshops with orders for their families, creating a frantic period where runners sprint through growing darkness, their precious cargo lighting up with spillage that glows like edible fireflies in the twilight. The boys call out to each other as they pass, sharing information about blocked routes and angry dogs, creating an information network that predates social media by centuries. They're not just delivering food, they're delivering convenience, time, and a tiny taste of luxury to people who work too hard to cook. As the last delivery runner vanishes into the London twilight, you find yourself standing in a quiet corner of the market square, watching the day's final vendors pack away their unsold wares. The frantic energy of medieval food commerce slowly settles like flour dust in a closing bakery. Those questionable meat pies that seemed so alarming at midnight now feel almost comforting in their familiar awfulness. The cheese that could double as a weapon, the ale that killed more germs than it created, the bread that challenged teeth and digestion alike, they all fed a civilization, one dubious bite at a time. The torches are being extinguished now, one by one, casting longer and softer shadows across the emptying streets. Somewhere, a night watchman munches on his pocket pie, that hard-crusted companion of the working poor. In the monastery, the brothers have finished their illicit midnight feast and return to their prayers, stomachs full of contradictions and preserved fruits. The sugar smugglers count their profits by candlelight, while nobles dream sweetly of their next marchpane fix. You realize that these medieval meals, hurried, questionable, innovative, and sometimes accidentally poisonous, built the foundation of modern food culture. Every food truck, every delivery app, every late-night drive-through owes something to these medieval pioneers who figured out that hungry people will pay for convenience, that time is money, and that food is always more than just sustenance. The last vendor's cart creaks away into the darkness. The market square lies empty, except for the odd cat investigating dropped crumbs. Your eyelids grow heavy as you imagine all those medieval workers, finally home, finally fed, finally resting. Tomorrow they'll wake and do it all again. But for now, the medieval world sleeps, its belly full of history's most questionable fast food. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be more peaceful than your digestion would have been after a proper medieval meal.